the 17th IMF agreement. And there we get, now we get 660 million US dollars annually for the next 4 years. But something that everyone keeps forgetting is that we pay surcharges and interest rates on this IMF loan. And for the next 8 years, from 2024 to 2033, we'll be paying 2 billion as interest rates and surcharges on a US dollar 2 billion on the IMF loan. So in terms of the treatment of this crisis, what we've seen is that the main focuses have been on primary surplus balance, primary surplus of the government, and targeting inflation so as to reduce it. So in the last year, in 2023, we've gone to a 0.6% surplus in the primary balance compared to a 3.7 deficit in 2022, and that is a massive jump. And from this year onwards, the central bank expects to control inflation. So these two targets, in terms of macro economic targets, have come of dispossessing so many people. In terms of the primary surplus, we saw one policy was to bring in price mechanisms to control, to sort of make pricing formulas for energy. And these pricing formulas have increased electricity costs by 400% over the last year itself, last 2 years since 2022. While CEB records profits of 52 billion rupees in the last year, it has come at the cost of dispossessing over 1 million people. Then we had the regressive taxes that we imposed, like the VAT, and this comes at a time at high cost of living. So while 9 out of 10 families have increased their household expenditure, and 6 out of 10 are facing a reduction in their income, on top of this 50% reduction in the real value of their incomes, we see that the government tries to impose more regressive taxes that the burden is shared by working people. It's not taxation should come on based on the principle of redistribution, but it's not based on the principle of redistribution. It's rather based on the IMF principle that what is the fastest way of earning a government income, and therefore let's implement. Let's go ahead with it. So all these austerity measures are to meet the debt sustainability needs of the IMF through a primary surplus. So we are also dispossessing people in terms of our social protection system, and we know that since during COVID, Sri Lanka was one of the countries that spent the least amount on social protection, and right now the IMF program itself has capped the spending on social protection at a 0.6% of GDP, and there have been massive cuts to the social protection through the new Ask program. And this doesn't only mean dispossessing people of any financial assistance from the state, also means dispossessing them the right to connect and engage with the state. We also saw one of the last treatments is that instead of restructuring our external debt, which is the debt we defaulted on, we first went and restructured our superannuation funds, our ETF and ETF. These cuts are the only savings to working people, as everyone knows. And because of the crisis that materialized in 2020, people have faced a reduction in the value of their ETF by 40%. And on top of it, in the next 10 years, we will see a reduction in the value of their savings by 30% more. So these so-called treatments are not just happening to the lives that people are realizing living presently, but through these reforms, we are going to see an onslaught on people's futures. And it's all just to treat an external debt crisis. So why are we here for the 16th time, 17th time at the IMF? What happened to the last 16 agreements? All these solutions are focused on liberalizing trade, making sure that we are dependent on imports, and therefore undermining local production. It also comes at the fire sale of local assets, of public assets, and state-owned enterprises, and services that people access. And why are we going through this entire structural reform process is to return to private credit markets for development. And that is then lies the problem. Why are we relying on private commercial credit for development, for mitigating and facing climate risks? This is not just a problem for Sri Lanka. It's a problem for the entire global south and therefore a global crisis. We are in a global debt crisis. Since the global financial crisis in 2007, the debt of developing countries have doubled. 62% of developing countries' external debt are owed to private creditors. We are relying on private credit for our development needs. So the problem here with the private credit markets is the biggest problem is that there is a discrepancy in the charges that we owe and pay to these private creditors. So where the UNCTAD has done a report on this, and it stated that when Germany pays at least 1.5% in charges for the private credit they get, countries like Africa pay 11%, and Asian countries pay about 6.5%. Whereas America, the USA pays about 3.1%. So we are charged this extra fee called the risk premium, but when this risk transpires, we're still owed the entirety of our debt. We are not given bigger cuts even when this risk materializes. So in developing countries, we pay about 60.5% of our public expenditure to repay debts, whereas we pay 40% for education, 55% for health. And this is a massive problem when it comes to countries like us. Where do we go to get debt? We still need debt, sure. But is the private credit market the place to go? No. Then why is the IMF keeps on pushing us to go into these markets? Why are we doing all these reforms to make sure that they are attractive enough to go and return back to these markets? Since COVID, there have been so many countries in the global south that have defaulted. Ghana, Suriname, Zambia, Lebanon, Sri Lanka just being one. We have been able to get out of our IMF agreements previously, but this time it's really hard for us because we have defaulted on this credit. And I think Amali and Dr. Ayman will present more on this. So the treatments for this crisis are repeatedly treating our cases of debt crisis as a national governance and economic governance crisis, as opposed to and a corruption issue, as opposed to a corruption issue of a larger global financial architecture. So with that, I will end and hand it over to
Thanks very much, Madhulika. And what we heard from Madhulika was to once again remind us about the nature of the crisis that millions of households in our country are facing, a crisis when it comes to being off the grid, disconnected from electricity, a crisis when it comes to being afford to meet basic household expenses because of this regressive value-added tax, which punishes the poor always more than those who are better off. A situation which many of you will be familiar with, where the number of dropouts in our schools, children being pulled out of education has increased, an ongoing problem of unemployment, and still, of course, large numbers seeking to migrate out of this country because they simply do not see a future for themselves here. And Madhulika also, remember, located the Sri Lankan debt crisis within the crisis of debt in the global south. The question that we must ask ourselves is, if the medicine is the right medicine, why is it that since 1982 and the Mexican debt crisis, more countries are in the debt trap? More countries have a larger stock or volume of debt. More countries are having to enter into these austerity programs. So if the medicine has been the right medicine, why is it not working? Why is it killing the patient? So let's hear now from Ahim.
So as we heard from Madhulika, the IMF program, the IMF solution is actually making the crisis worse. Now, if the IMF solution is making the crisis worse, what is the way out of this? This is the 17th IMF agreement, but the 17th IMF agreement is different because Sri Lanka has defaulted on its debt, and the IMF is considered the arbiter for debt resolution by the Paris Club, for example, and they require an IMF program for debt restructuring. So in that sense, the IMF has a stranglehold on us. What they say is if you don't have the IMF program, then you cannot have debt resolution. So what is the way out? The problem is that there is, first of all, a conflict of interest in the role of the IMF. The IMF is considered an arbiter for debt resolution, but the IMF is also a lender. And as we heard from Madhulika, this so-called IMF bailout, 3 billion US dollars, it translates to just about 60 million US dollars a month, whereas Sri Lanka's foreign earnings is 30 times that much, 1,800 million US dollars. So there's no IMF bailout. But what the IMF is going to do to us is that over the next 10 years, for this 3 billion US dollar loan, they're going to pay 2 billion US dollars in interest payments. Right? So there's no IMF bailout, there is extraction by the IMF, while the IMF claims that it is the arbiter. So there's clearly a conflict of interest. So we have to think of other arbiters, other ways of restructuring this debt. And this is not just about Sri Lanka, this is the case for so many other countries in the global south. Now, how do we view this large debt stock in the case of Sri Lanka, if we include all our external debt on the order of 51 billion US dollars? First of all, it is justified that this debt should be reduced because over our post-colonial period, not only Sri Lanka, so many countries, there has been a constant extraction of countries like ours by the Western world through what is called the terms of trade, for example. Our exports earn much less and they earn much more by exporting to us. Much of this debt can be characterized as odious debt. This is not debt that benefited the people. This is debt that was used to extract from the Sri Lankan people by external creditors, as well as by our own elite, the people sitting in government today. And they are the ones who are deciding how this debt is going to be restructured. And finally, what do we do if we cannot repay this debt? Unless there is cancellation, there is no other way forward. So there are many justifications why this debt needs to be greatly reduced. But what is the IMF saying? According to the IMF, through this debt restructuring process, and the government has also come out and said they're just going to reduce it by 30%. Reducing the debt stock by 30% would mean our total debt, external and domestic together, is going to be 95% of our GDP. The next shock is just going to push us back into default. So this is not sustainable. While the IMF and the government might speak about 30% reduction of debt, the bondholders with whom the government is negotiating are talking about 20% and even possibly 10% reduction of debt. In other words, they don't really care about Sri Lanka coming out of this debt crisis. The IMF, and to some extent our government, and definitely the donors, all they care about is that the creditors are repaid. That is the process. And once the creditors are repaid, what is the end program of this IMF program? What is the end goal of it? It is so that we can again go and float an international sovereign bond. It says that in the IMF agreement. Now, what needs to happen? This sort of debt resolution, this sort of debt arbitration is not going to take us anywhere. It is going to lead to the 18th IMF agreement and a second default. So what we need is a different process of debt arbitration. There might have to be a process maybe by another agency of the United Nations. We may have to convene a debt conference in Sri Lanka and start talking to the donors ourselves. We may have to make some tough decisions that maybe it doesn't make sense to go and borrow in the commercial markets. Because what did we do with our commercial market borrowing? Most of our international sovereign bonds, the interest payments were equal to the principal. We've already repaid the entire amount and more. And they want us to keep repaying. We might have to change the kind of economic policies that we take forward. If we allow our donors to decide, if we allow our elite to decide, we're going to have the highways, we're going to have the Lotus Tower. Does that lead to sustainable returns? No. We need a different process of development. We need planning, we need industrial policies, we need to deal with our food crisis, we need to focus on our food system. But these are policies that the IMF, the World Bank, the donors don't want us to take forward. They say no to industrial policies, while in the Western world, today, what is Biden doing? They're talking about industrial policies for the United States. The crisis in Sri Lanka is also about not planning. So we need to rethink all of that. So it is this kind of approach, and we can't do this alone. We need to link up with other countries that are in debt. We need a debtors coalition. We need to come together to be able to challenge the creditors. Sri Lanka by itself will be isolated, and this kind of restructuring will be imposed. But we all know the international financial system is broken. We need a new global financial architecture. Even the UN Secretary General has more or less come out and said this. Everybody knows it, but the political will has to come from our governments, not the kind of government that we have in power today. We need a different government. We need different governments around the world. But to start with, people's movements have to come together around the world and demand debt cancellation. So this is a large task, but we have to begin there. இறுதியாக நான் சில வார்த்தைகளை தமிழ்லையும் கூற விரும்புகின்றேன். இன்று நாங்கள் இந்த கடன் பிரச்சனை சம்பந்தமாக பேசிக் கொண்டிருக்கின்றோம். ஏற்கனவே முன்வைச்ச கருத்துக்கள் படி இந்த IMF உடைய சர்வதேச நாணய நிதியத்துடைய இந்த தீர்வு அல்லது திட்டம் என்பது ஒரு தீர்வு அல்ல. இதை எங்கள் மேலதிகமான ஒரு நெருக்கடிக்குள் தான் தள்ளிக்கொண்டிருக்கின்றனர். இதிலிருந்து நாங்கள் வெளிவருவதாக இருந்தால் நாங்கள் வித்தியாசமான அணுகுமுறைகளை முன்னெடுக்க வேண்டிய தேவை இருக்கின்றது. நிச்சயமாக இலங்கை போன்ற நாடுகளுக்கு, இது இலங்கை மட்டுமல்ல, இவ்வாறான ஒரு கடன் நெருக்கடிக்குள் இருக்கின்றது. உலகத்தில் 50க்கு மேற்பட்ட நாடுகள் இவ்வாறான கடன் நெருக்கடிக்குள், ஒரு கடன் பொறிக்குள் விழுந்திருக்கின்றன. அதிலிருந்து நாங்கள் மீண்டெழுவதாக இருந்தால் இந்த கடன் அடிப்படையில் பாதிக்கப்படும் நாடுகள் இணைந்து அவர்களுக்கான ஒரு இணைப்பூடாக நாங்கள் கோரிக்கைகளை முன்வைக்க வேண்டிய தேவை இருக்கின்றது. IMF இலங்கையுடைய கடன்களை தீர்க்கதும் பார்க்க IMF உடைய கடன் $3 பில்லியன் அமெரிக்கன் கடனுக்கு நாங்கள் அடுத்த 10 வருட காலத்தில் $2 பில்லியன் அமெரிக்கன் வட்டியை கட்டப் போகின்றோம். இவ்வாறான உடைமை இழப்பு தான் இந்த IMF உடைய தீர்வு என்று கூட கூறப்படுகின்றது. அந்த விதத்தில் இவ்வாறு கடன்பட்ட நாடுகள் இணைந்து கோரிக்கையை முன்வைக்க வேண்டிய தேவை இருக்கின்றது. ஆனால் உங்களுக்கு தெரியும், எங்களுடைய தற்போது இருக்கும் அரசாங்கமோ பல நாடுகளில் இருக்கும் அரசாங்கங்களும் இவ்வாறான தீர்வை முன்வைக்கப் போவதில்லை. ஆகவே மக்கள் இயக்கங்கள் மக்களுடைய போராட்டங்களூடாக மூன்றாம் உலகத்தை சேர்ந்த மக்கள் இணைந்து கோரிக்கைகளை முன்வைக்க வேண்டிய தேவை இருக்கின்றது. நன்றி வணக்கம்.
What Ahilan reminded us of is that the current approach to so-called restructuring of our debt, two things. One is it just kicks the can down the road. It does not deal with the problem. Remember that up to now, until even if this IMF program carries on, what we've been doing is servicing, repaying multilateral debt. But come 2027, they will come for their money. So all this talk about how our reserves are rising by the month, 1 year of debt repayment not just will wipe that out, but there just simply will not be enough in the treasury even to repay 1 year worth of debt repayments post 2027. So the can is being kicked down the road. And secondly, as Anilan very importantly reminded us, debt restructuring is not the same as debt justice. Debt justice, those who did not take those decisions, those who did not benefit from the loans that were taken, are being asked to repay them. Those who did take those loans are scot-free and on their way to Australia. So that what is happening now is not debt justice. Debt justice is differentiating between financing which had a positive development outcome for the people of Sri Lanka and that which went into the pockets of the elite. So let's now hear from Amali, who will focus also on the issue of private credit, of what's been in the news recently around negotiations with private creditors. Remember, 48% of our debt as of 2022 was owned by these private creditors. And you heard from Madhulika about how much globally too, right? And you heard from Ahilan how the objective of this IMF loan is to go back to the very same people who are now demanding more than their pound of flesh from us. So let's hear from Amma.
Thank you, Kumar. Welcome you all to the launch of Yukti, where we are trying to, I think, create an alternative imagination, open up the space and create alternative imaginations to go beyond the noose that we are going to be stuck in. I think government has announced that the debt restructuring will be concluded in June. which means that our fate is going to be sealed for the foreseeable future. And we are looking forward for elections, new governments, but the parties or the political power alliances that are going to come to power in the coming months will have this sealed fate, and we are going to be put inside the debtor's prison. Of course, it's not an enclosure, but an open prison, right? Where our fiscal and economic, monetary and economic sovereignty will be sealed. So, Ahilan and Madhulika pointed out how IMF is not the arbiter. It is actually the part of a problem. It is the part of the problem. That the fact that we are going to the IMF for the 17th time, and if you look at the world experiences from Africa to Latin America, uh, I mean, we have enough evidences to show that IMF is not the answer. It is part of the problem. And we are, I think, now loudly acknowledging today that the second default is built in to the plan. And how the second default will be, we saw that the first default already has beaten the working people. Their pension funds have borne the exclusive brunt of a domestic debt restructuring. And can we even imagine what the second default will have? Right? What will be the consequences, and would we have the resilience to face the second default? Because we are, and I think as Ahilan and Madhulika pointed out, unlike previous IMF engagements, 17th engagement has been making permanent changes to the Sri Lankan socio-economic polity, political polity. They are emphasizing on legal reforms. So our character of the Sri Lankan state and our society and economy has been radically changed. We are dismantling the developmental infrastructure of our economy, right? We are in the course of a privatization process, and we might be opening up our public enterprises to the grabs of some of these bondholders. I think we have woken up to the possibilities with VFS and Blackstone being one of the investors, right? Blackstone is also already in Sri Lanka. They have invested in Primal Glass, so they are already there. And we don't know about our. I mean, we don't even know who our bondholders are, because 72% of the the bondholders are hidden. We don't know about them. We only know a couple of them. So this is the scenarios that we are dealing with. So, and I think Ahilan also spoke about how we should really dissent, dissent the solutions that we are presented with, come up, form an alliance. The other developing countries are already getting into alliances in Africa, in Latin America. Sri Lanka cannot fight this alone. There has to be a southern alliance of developing countries. And I would like to, I'm not going to actually speak about the private creditors, but about this, speak more to the new nature of this debt crisis that we are in, and to open up a discussion for a possible pathway that Sri Lanka has not, I mean, we in Sri Lanka, about, has kind of shied away from. That's the odious debt discourse. So, many of you would know what odious debt is. Basically, there are two criteria to determine what odious debt is. One criteria will be that the debt incurred have not spent in the interest of the public, that the debt is not used for the public investments for the benefit of the larger public. The other one will be to talk about the creditor's responsibility, that we all talk about debt restructuring, and the government and the bondholders have, and the Paris Club have presented their deals. So it seemed like that we are bounded to this fate of repaying our debt at whatever cost. we mean the working people of Sri Lanka, right? And and we don't seem to have any kind of negotiation or space to negotiate, to space to arbitrate, right? Space to demand a greater cut of our debt stock. This is what we actually at least see from what the government present to us. The debt restructuring deal that the government presented is worse than the debt restructuring deal that the bondholders have presented, right? So we wonder, like, where on whose side does the government stand? On whose side does the central bank stand? So then we would wonder whether maybe the government is kind of helpless. So what kind of debt negotiation platform leads a government, a sovereign government? I think let's forget that this particular government does not have a mandate, but they are representing a sovereign country, Sri Lanka, right? So, what kind of debt restructuring platform or a framework leads a sovereign government helpless, right? So, I think I think that also speaks to the nature of the international financial architecture that the IMF and the World Bank tries to safeguard, that they are coming again and again by pretending to bail us out, but in fact trying to trap us into this particular system. So, in my opinion, odious debt provides us a way out. So, by pointing out that, I mean, there's the responsibility is also at the level of the creditors. It's not only at the level of the indebted country and the people. In Sri Lanka, I think we talk about corruption. It is part of our daily conversation, right? We have, I mean, gone through Aragalaya, where the corruption of the political elite and the economic elite made the headlines. And I think that was a greater impetus in driving Aragalaya itself. And our political parties talk about corruption and need for good governance. The IMF itself has come up with the governance diagnostic report and point out at corruption as making it seem like a private problem, that it is this developing third world poor countries plagued with corruption. But the problem is that corruption, if you look at how it has worked over decades, corruption is actually part of the strategy. The ruling elite and the economic elite from 1977 have made use of corruption to dismantle the public state, the public services, and the public infrastructure. So it is actually the gateway for their private interest, right? Privatization is, I mean, to legitimize privatization. But I think we in the left, in the progressive circles, I mean, though as much as we are acknowledging corruption, have not incorporated corruption into the discussion of debt, public debt. If we do, I think odious debt should not seem like a kind of a hypothetical scenario, because odious debt is, there are countries, it's even in the recent past, there's concrete examples of where countries from the developing countries use the odious debt framework. And odious debt framework is not only a hypothetical thing, there's a legal doctrine, the doctrine of odious debt. They have used countries like Ecuador, uh, Iraq in 2003, Ecuador in 2007 and 8, used the doctrine of odious debt or illegitimate debt to reduce their debt stock in a significant proportion. So it gives us a leverage, actually, leverage to fight with the bondholders and the other bilateral and multilateral creditors. Like we have acknowledged that multilateral debt in Sri Lanka will not be restructured. We are paying. ADB is the largest multilateral creditor in Sri Lanka. So while we are shying away from the ODS debt framework, we already have the ground material. The Auditors General Department has done the groundwork and have given us the preliminary material to begin our task. So I'd like to kind of quote from three special Auditor General reports presented in 2018, 2019, and 2022. So there, the Auditor General remarks, by December 31st, 2016, gap between total debt payable by Government of Sri Lanka and value of total debt finance assets was 7.8 trillion Sri Lankan rupees. So this is the gap between the borrowing and the assets, debt finance assets. So the total debt payable stood at 2016 stood at 8.9 trillion, and total assets was only worth of 1.1 trillion. So where did this gap? Where did the money go? If the loans did not materialize in creating concrete assets. And the original report points out that significant portion of the net borrowing was used for recurrent purposes. So it's like for daily needs, right? And there's a lot of problems in accounting public debt and debt finance assets. Central Bank is and Ministry of Finance and Treasury, they are the key responsible government entities to record these transactions, as well as the central bank has an extra responsibility because they have the mandate to manage public debt. And the Auditor General points out towards the culpability of the central bank for that they have not accomplished its responsibility for operating borrowings to maximize benefits for the public. And he also finds non-compliance with laws, rules, and regulations in case of foreign borrowing. So this preliminary material gives us enough room and substance to construct the ODS debt campaign. To demand or to call that Sri Lanka's public debt is as odious. Then I think we can demand, I think as Aileen pointed out, we cannot agree that IMF is the arbiter, they are not. So we can demand for an international commission, independent international commission, or we ourselves can formulate a commission and conduct a debt audit, like other countries, like the Ecuador and Mexico, or even in Greece. Though in Greece it failed, all these countries conducted debt audits to understand the nature of the legitimacy of the debt composition. And there are international experts if we want to call for their assistance. Eric Toussaint from CADTM has worked a lot on third world debt and illegitimate debt. There is Leon's Nibikumani and James Boyce from University of Kerry Institute from University of Amherst. Then there are others like Michael Hudson who have spoken in great deal about ODS debt. I think there are these options that we should pursue, right, without waiting in silence or being helpless before our fate is sealed into the debtor's prison. Thank you.
Thank you, Amali, for reminding us how many of the changes that are taking place in the name of so-called economic reform or economic recovery risk being irreversible. When you start to dismantle something, you dismantle our education system, you dismantle our health system. People forget, once upon a time, nobody talks about entitlements to food any longer. We've already forgotten. We've forgotten that once upon a time it was possible to protect people's right to food through price controls, through a system of provision of basic foods, through guaranteeing the poorest households access to a basic nutritional intake. That was dismantled. And see, 40 years later, none of us speak about it. We've already lost it. We've already forgotten. And this will be the story when it comes to our system of public education and public health. This is the way it will go too. The same way protection of the right to food is erased even from the memory of progressive movements and organizations. Even during an economic crisis which hits people in their stomachs, where we know that there are families, there are individuals who cut back on the number of meals, who cut back on the quality of the food that they eat. This is happening today, still in this country. But we don't hear them. These people are invisible.